North Africa, 1942. The desert wind howled like a furnace. Fine sand bit into everything: eyes, gears, skin. Under that merciless sun, a column of American vehicles crawled forward, their engines gasping in the heat. At the front of the line, barely taller than the tires of a German half-track, bounced a squat little car with round headlights and a snub nose. It didn't roar or thunder like the tanks. It simply chugged along, unbothered by the ridges and rocks that stopped heavier machines. Through German binoculars on a distant ridge, it looked almost comical. One officer smirked and called it ein Spielzeugauto, a toy car. His men laughed, but that toy would soon outrun their pride. When American troops first arrived in North Africa, even some of their own commanders doubted the strange little machine. It was boxy, exposed, and crude. It looked like something a farmer might use to haul feed, not a vehicle for war. The Germans had sleek armored half-tracks, the British had their desert cruisers, and the Americans had this. The troops nicknamed it everything from Peep to Puddle Jumper. Some soldiers joked that it looked like a mailbox on wheels. Others wondered if it could survive even a day against Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was, after all, smaller than the German motorcycles that scouts used to patrol the dunes. The vehicle's official name wasn't even clear yet. On the papers, it was a 1/4 ton 4x4 reconnaissance truck. The term Jeep had come from Army slang, GP, for general purpose. Mechanics shortened it, soldiers repeated it, and soon everyone called it that. The Jeep. Simple, punchy, and unpretentious, like the machine itself. One young mechanic named Tom Kelly remembered the first time he saw one roll off the ship at Oran. The driver, grinning through dust-streaked goggles, shouted, "You can drive this thing anywhere," and promptly steered it off the pier into the sand. The Jeep didn't sink. Powered through, its little four-cylinder engine coughing but refusing to quit. "I thought it'd stall out," Kelly later said. Instead it climbed that beach like a mountain goat. The men laughed then, not out of mockery but surprise. For the first time, they sensed there was something special here. Something different from the polished machines they'd been promised in training films. The irony was that the Jeep had been born from desperation. Just 2 years earlier, in 1940, the U.S. Army had realized it needed a light, fast vehicle for scouting and command work. Horses were gone, motorcycles were too vulnerable, and trucks were too heavy. The Army sent out a challenge to the nation's car makers. Design a 4-wheel drive vehicle that could carry men and guns, climb a 30-degree hill, weigh less than 1,300 pounds, and be built in just 49 days. Most companies laughed it off. It sounded impossible. Only a small, struggling firm in Pennsylvania, the Bantam Car Company, dared to try. Engineer Carl Probst designed the first prototype in 5 days flat, working from dawn till midnight with nothing but pencil drawings and courage. When Bantam tested their model before Army brass, the car bounded over logs, splashed through rivers, and conquered terrain no vehicle its size ever had. The Army was stunned. It worked, but bureaucracy almost killed it. Because Bantam was too small to mass produce, the Army handed the blueprints to larger companies, Willys-Overland and Ford. They refined it, strengthened it, and soon the Willys MB became the standard Jeep of the U.S. military. By 1942, production was roaring, and thousands were being shipped overseas. What began as a desperate sketch in a small Pennsylvania garage had become the backbone of Allied mobility. Still, on the battlefront, respect was slow to come. Soldiers trusted tanks and trucks, not toys. The Jeep had no armor. Its windshield folded down, exposing the driver. It rattled like a tin can at high speed. Yet when the desert demanded endurance, it was the Jeep that survived. It didn't need roads. It made them. It didn't overheat like heavier engines. It could be repaired with a wrench and a prayer. The troops learned to love it the hard way through experience. When supply convoys bogged down in soft sand, Jeeps darted ahead, hauling water and ammo. When communications broke, it raced across the lines carrying messages. When wounded men lay trapped under fire, medics strapped stretchers to the hood and raced them to safety. At Kasserine Pass, where the Americans suffered one of their first major defeats, witnesses recalled a haunting sight. A lone Jeep weaving through smoke and chaos, its driver wounded but refusing to stop, ferrying injured comrades out of the battlefield. "That little bastard saved lives that day," one sergeant said afterward. "No medals, no fanfare, just grit and wheels." It wasn't glamorous, but it was unforgettable. From that moment, the Jeep stopped being a joke. By mid-1943, the laughter had faded even among the Germans. Axis reconnaissance reports began to mention the American light four-wheel vehicles that seemed to appear everywhere at once. They were too quick to hit with artillery, too light to sink in mud, and too reliable to break down. German soldiers gave them grudging respect, sometimes even stealing captured Jeeps when they could. One panzer officer reportedly said, "If we had your little car, we would drive to Cairo tomorrow." The Jeep, once mocked as a toy, had become a phantom of the desert, small, elusive, unstoppable. The irony deepened when General Eisenhower himself called it one of the three decisive weapons of World War II, alongside the DC-3 aircraft and the landing craft. He wasn't exaggerating. Wherever the U.S. Army went, the Jeep went first. It hauled cables for engineers, pulled artillery into position, carried generals through minefields, and sometimes served as an ambulance, a mail truck, or even a mobile chapel. It was, as soldiers said, as faithful as a dog and twice as brave. Still, in those early North African days, no one could have predicted how far it would go. From scorching deserts to the beaches of Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Its steel was thin, but its spirit was indestructible. In the midst of doubt and mockery, the Jeep had already begun rewriting the rules of war. It didn't win battles with firepower, it won them with persistence. By the time the sun sank behind the dunes that evening in 1942, the laughter on that German ridge had faded into silence. The toy car had slipped through their lines once again, carrying a reconnaissance officer and a radio that would help direct the next Allied strike. As darkness swallowed the desert, its tiny engine hummed somewhere beyond hearing. Steady, defiant, unstoppable. They called it a joke. They called it a mistake. But soon, every soldier on both sides would know another word for it. Victory. They called it a joke. It became a legend. Sometimes the smallest machine changes the biggest wars. This was not a car. It was a soldier in steel. And the story was only just beginning. In 1940, long before the Jeep roared across the deserts of Africa, the United States Army faced an embarrassing problem. Its motor pool was outdated, filled with clumsy trucks and motorcycles that broke down more often than they moved. Europe was already at war, and American observers watching German blitzkrieg tactics realized that mobility, fast, flexible mobility, was now the key to modern warfare. Yet when the Army asked its suppliers for a light, all-terrain vehicle that could move men and equipment quickly across rough ground, most companies simply shrugged. They said it couldn't be done. What the military wanted was impossible. A four-wheel drive car that could carry 600 pounds of gear, climb a 30-degree hill, turn on a dime, and weigh less than 1,300 pounds. It had to be built from scratch and delivered in just 49 days. The only company brave or desperate enough to try was the bankrupt American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. Their staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. Their funds were nearly gone. But their engineer, Karl Probst, a quiet, determined man, took the challenge personally. Working around the clock, he drafted a complete design in less than a week. He borrowed parts from whatever was available. Axles from one model, steering columns from another, and an engine that had already been considered obsolete. When the prototype, named the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, rolled out of the workshop in September 1940, it looked crude and unfinished. But when the Army tested it, something remarkable happened. It didn't break. It bounced, it climbed, it splashed, and it kept moving where other vehicles had failed. Generals watched in disbelief as it climbed a muddy slope that had stopped a six-wheel truck dead in its tracks. Still, the Army doubted Bantam's ability to mass-produce such a vehicle. Bureaucracy took over. They handed Bantam's blueprints to two bigger companies, Willys-Overland and Ford, under the justification of national necessity. It was an infuriating betrayal for the small Pennsylvania team that had proven it could be done. But progress demanded scale. Willys added a more powerful Go Devil engine, and Ford standardized mass production techniques. Both versions were nearly identical, built to Bantam's spirit and design. Eventually, the Willys MB became the definitive Jeep, while Ford's version carried the same DNA under the hood. The early prototypes, however, were far from perfect. During winter trials in Maryland and later in Louisiana, Jeeps overturned on sharp turns. Frames cracked under rough testing. The brakes were unpredictable. Drivers complained that the steering felt like wrestling an iron bull. Yet, despite these flaws, officers saw something special. It was agile, small enough to hide behind trees, and simple enough to fix with a wrench and some wire. "This thing doesn't care what's in front of it," one test driver wrote in his notes. "It just goes." That became the Jeep's unofficial motto. It just goes. As America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the need for mobility became urgent. Production ramped up. Factories in Ohio and Michigan roared day and night. Willys built more than 350,000 Jeeps, and Ford added another 270,000. Mechanics simplified the design further. Flat fenders so soldiers could sit or write on them, a foldable windshield for storage, and drain holes so rainwater could escape when it poured. Every decision was made for practicality. The Jeep didn't have luxury. It had purpose. But before the Jeep earned its legendary reputation, it faced humiliation and loss. In early North Africa, many soldiers still preferred heavy trucks. When the first Jeeps rolled into Tunisia, they were used as messenger cars, not combat vehicles. Some commanders ordered them to tow small guns, others to ferry officers. But one day, during a supply mission near Kasserine, a column of heavier trucks got bogged down in sand. Temperatures hit 120 degrees. Engines overheated and quit. Water was running low. Then a sergeant decided to send a pair of Jeeps ahead to find help. The Jeeps bounced over dunes like insects. Light, quick, untiring. Within hours they returned, engines smoking but alive, guiding a rescue convoy to the stranded men. From that day, the troops stopped laughing. They called it the mule that never dies. The revelation came slowly but unmistakably. The Jeep wasn't just a car, it was a tool for survival. Soldiers began improvising with it. They strapped machine guns to its rear, turning it into a mobile weapon. They mounted stretchers across the hood, converting it into an ambulance. They tied jerry cans, radios, even coffins to it when needed. Mechanics discovered that parts were interchangeable between different makes, so they cannibalized wrecked Jeeps to keep others running. It became a symbol of self-reliance. You didn't wait for orders when you had a Jeep, you made your own path. One of the most striking early demonstrations came during Operation Torch in late 1942. As American and British forces invaded North Africa, Jeeps led the way off the landing ships. While tanks struggled to move inland, Jeeps raced up beaches and into villages, scouting routes and relaying coordinates to artillery units. In the chaos, they often became the first contact between advancing Allied troops and local populations. Photos of those landings circulated in newspapers back home. Young soldiers standing beside their squat, dust-covered vehicles, smiling like boys who had found freedom on four wheels. German intelligence noticed too. Reports described the new American vehicle as klein aber gefahrlich, small but dangerous. Captured Jeeps were repainted with swastikas and reused by Axis forces whenever possible. The enemy respected it, and that was perhaps the highest compliment. One German officer wrote after the war, "The Americans had a car that went anywhere. We had none." In Italy, the Jeep proved its worth on mountain roads where trucks could not go. It carried ammunition up goat trails, hauled wounded men down under fire, and even towed small anti-tank guns over terrain that should have been impossible. It was noisy, uncomfortable, and dangerous, but it got the job done. Soldiers joked that if you treated it gently, it would bite you. But if you drove it like you hated it, it would never fail. Back home, the factories couldn't keep up with the demand. Every Jeep came off the line identical, rugged, and cheap. Willys engineers made sure every bolt and joint could be repaired with basic tools. The design was modular, parts could be swapped between thousands of vehicles in the field. And when the army asked for something more amphibious, the Jeep adapted again, turning into the floating Seep, a semi-boat version that crossed rivers and swamps. It wasn't perfect, but it showed that the same DNA could evolve anywhere. The Jeep's true revelation came not from its creators, but from the soldiers who drove it. They began to see it not as a vehicle, but as a companion loyal, stubborn, unbreakable. A sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division wrote in a letter home, "You talk to it like a dog. You curse it, you kick it, you thank it. It listens in its own way." Many gave their Jeeps nicknames: Lil Trouble, Faithful, Lucky, or Old Betsy. These were not just machines, they were lifelines. By the time Allied forces began pushing into Sicily in 1943, the Jeep had already earned its place in military legend. What began as a rejected blueprint from a bankrupt factory had become the beating heart of the world's most powerful army. Soldiers began calling it America's warhorse. It was faster than a mule, tougher than a truck, and more loyal than luck itself. But as the Allies prepared to storm Fortress Europe, new challenges awaited. Could this tiny machine that survived deserts and mountains survive the brutal beaches of Normandy? Would its engines still roar when the Atlantic surf turned to smoke and fire? The men didn't know, but one thing was certain. Wherever the American flag went next, the Jeep would be in front, headlights cutting through the fog of war, ready once again to prove that simplicity was its own kind of genius. By 1943, the little vehicle that began as a desperate experiment had become the beating heart of the Allied war machine. The Jeep no longer needed an introduction, it was everywhere. From the burning sands of Libya to the snow-capped peaks of the Apennines, wherever an American, British, or Free French soldier marched, a Jeep's engine growled nearby. It was the first sound of arrival and the last sound before withdrawal. The Germans, who had once sneered at its stubby nose and flimsy frame, now feared what it symbolized: American adaptability. The same small machine that was once dismissed as a toy had turned into the silent predator of the battlefield. The transformation began in the dust and blood of Tunisia. The U.S. Army had taken its beatings, learned fast, and adapted faster. Generals discovered that the Jeep could do the work of 10 vehicles. In reconnaissance missions, it darted ahead of tank columns, its small frame nearly invisible against the terrain. Carried radios, officers, ammunition, and hope. The desert wind whipped around its open body, filling every crevice with grit. But the Go Devil engine never faltered. The Jeep didn't need roads, it made them. The soldiers driving it began to realize that what they had wasn't just transportation, it was freedom. "When you're behind that wheel," one lieutenant said, "you feel like nothing can stop you. Not the sand, not the enemy, not even fear." When the Italian campaign began, the Jeep proved it could climb mountains. Soldiers joked that if you pointed it toward the moon, it would try to get there. In the steep, twisting roads of Monte Cassino, it carried stretchers of the wounded, headlights off to avoid enemy fire, guided only by moonlight. It slipped through mud, ruts, and shell craters, hauling supplies up cliffs where mules refused to go. The Army engineers loved it, medics trusted it, and officers depended on it. It became the thread that tied the entire Allied effort together. A machine without rank serving generals and privates alike. As the war expanded, so did the Jeep's legend. The British SAS and Long-Range Desert Group customized theirs into fast attack vehicles, stripped of windshields and doors, armed with Vickers machine guns and extra fuel cans. These desert raiders used Jeeps to strike deep behind German lines, ambushing convoys, sabotaging airfields, and vanishing into the dunes before sunrise. The Germans nicknamed them ghost wagons. In the Pacific, Marines lashed palm leaves to the sides for camouflage and used them to drag wounded comrades out of Japanese fire. It was said that wherever a Jeep went, the front line went with it. By 1944, production had exploded. Ford and Willys together were building nearly one Jeep every 2 minutes. Over 600,000 would eventually roll off the assembly lines. Each one identical, each one destined for a different corner of the world. And they weren't just tools, they were symbols. GIs sent home photos of themselves grinning behind the wheel, boots on the fender, the name of a sweetheart painted on the hood. To the home front, the Jeep became the face of American ingenuity. Plain, rugged, unstoppable. Henry Ford himself once said, The Jeep did more for victory than all our fancy models combined. Even Soviet soldiers received thousands of them under Lend-Lease and praised their reliability in the harsh Eastern Front. As the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the Jeep was right at the center of the plan. In the days before D-Day, thousands of Jeeps were waterproofed, their exhausts raised, their engines sealed with grease. They were loaded onto landing craft, strapped tight beside tanks and trucks, ready to hit the beaches of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, when the ramps dropped and chaos erupted, the little vehicles rolled into hell itself. Shells exploded in the surf, machine guns tore through men and metal alike, and still, the Jeeps moved forward, hauling medics, radio men, engineers, and officers through mud and fire. One soldier wrote, "You could hear their engines over the artillery, a steady hum that sounded like courage." The Germans were stunned. Reports from Normandy described a flood of small four-wheel vehicles that swarmed the countryside faster than tanks could react. Where panzer divisions expected to crush slow convoys, they found themselves outflanked by tiny machines darting through hedgerows and villages, relaying coordinates to Allied artillery with deadly precision. "The enemy moves with terrifying speed," one captured officer confessed. "Their little cars are everywhere." In one village outside St. Lo, a Jeep carrying a field medic and 3 wounded men raced through a minefield after a mortar hit nearby. The driver's helmet was gone, his arm bleeding, but he kept his foot on the gas. When the Jeep cleared the mines, the men burst into laughter, half from relief, half from disbelief. "She flies when she has to," the medic said later. "She's got more heart than half the men out here." Normandy turned the Jeep from a tool into a legend. The tires carved paths through mud, rubble, and smoke. When the push toward Paris began, convoys of Jeeps led the way, ferrying commanders and messages across the front. In liberation parades, children climbed onto their hoods to wave flags, soldiers tossed candy from the seats, and generals saluted from the same open cabins that had carried them through gunfire days earlier. The Jeep had become the people's chariot of freedom. And still, the war demanded more. In the harsh winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, temperatures dropped below freezing. Tanks froze solid. Trucks refused to start. The Jeep didn't care. Soldiers lit fires beneath the engines to warm them, and once they roared to life, they roared all day. Jeeps carried ammunition through blizzards, rescued trapped platoons, and shuttled generals like Patton across front lines. "If it moves, salute it," Patton once said. "If it doesn't, paint it olive drab and put wheels on it." He wasn't joking. The Jeep embodied the American solution to war. Simple, fast, effective. Even the enemy couldn't hide its respect. In captured diaries, German soldiers wrote about the frustration of fighting an army that could move anywhere, anytime. "They come out of nowhere," one wrote. "Not tanks, not trucks, just small beasts that never stop." Hitler himself reportedly ordered engineers to develop a copy, but none could match its simplicity. The American advantage wasn't in power, it was in practicality. As the Allies swept into Germany in 1945, the Jeep led the charge. It rolled through shattered towns and across blown bridges. Photos from the final weeks of the war showed Jeeps leading victory parades, towing artillery, carrying prisoners, and ferrying reporters to the front lines. It had outlived mockery, outperformed expectation, and outsmarted one of the most powerful armies in history. A machine that weighed barely a ton had helped defeat an empire built on steel and arrogance. When the guns finally fell silent, the Jeep was still moving, across France, Italy, and the ruins of Berlin. It had earned its reputation not through luxury, but through loyalty. "It was our friend," one veteran said. "It carried us to hell and back, and it never asked for anything but gas." By war's end, the statistics told the story. Over 600,000 built, serving in every theater of war. It ferried presidents and privates alike. It carried priests to the front to give last rites. It even pulled gliders from muddy fields and served as makeshift railcars on bombed-out train tracks. It was, as General Eisenhower declared, as vital to the war as the airplane and the rifle. And yet, for all its numbers and achievements, the Jeep's true power wasn't measured in steel or horsepower. It was measured in the faces of the men it carried, the exhausted, mud-caked, determined faces of soldiers who knew that no matter how bad the odds, their little machine would get them home. The war had turned that once-mocked toy into the greatest military vehicle ever built. And as it rolled through the wreckage of Europe, splattered with mud and victory dust, one truth was undeniable. Wherever freedom advanced, a Jeep led the way. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, bridges broken, and millions of soldiers longed to go home. Yet one sound still echoed through the rubble: the steady purr of the little four-cylinder engine that had carried them through every battlefield. Jeeps rolled down the same roads where tanks once thundered, not in battle this time, but in peace. They hauled supplies for refugees, helped rebuild villages, and escorted children through towns that smelled of smoke and freedom. For the soldiers who had driven them through fire and fear, seeing their Jeeps covered in flowers instead of mud was almost surreal. The war was over, but the legend of the Jeep had just begun. American soldiers didn't want to part with them. Many begged to buy the Jeeps they had driven, giving them nicknames and personalities as if they were comrades. Old Betsy, Lucky Seven, Faithful Mary. These weren't machines anymore, they were companions. The U.S. Army, however, had orders to dispose of surplus vehicles. Thousands were scrapped or pushed off docks to prevent flooding foreign markets. Yet countless soldiers secretly saved them, bribing officers, hiding them on transport ships, or buying them from local farmers who had found abandoned ones. In Italy, France, and the Philippines, the sight of a dusty Jeep became the lasting image of liberation. To many civilians, that little olive-drab vehicle represented America itself. Stubborn, fast, loud, and free. Back home, Willys-Overland knew the story wasn't over. They quickly retooled their factories, turning the military Jeep into a civilian version called the CJ-2A, Civilian Jeep. It hit the market in 1945, advertised as the Jeep, the universal car. The slogan wasn't an exaggeration. Farmers used it to plow fields. Hunters used it to reach mountains. Construction workers used it to haul timber. For the first time, Americans could buy the same machine that had won a world war. Willys didn't need to invent a myth. The soldiers had already done that for them. They printed ads showing GIs leaning against their Jeeps, smiling in post-war sunlight, with captions like, "Now it's time for peace work." The Jeep became part of American identity, an industrial miracle that had carried democracy across continents. But the Jeep's role in shaping the post-war world was far greater than selling cars. It became the backbone of rebuilding efforts. In devastated France, Jeeps carried medical supplies and engineers into regions unreachable by trucks. In the Philippines and Burma, they became ambulances and school buses. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration used fleets of them to deliver food and medicine to war-torn villages. Wherever there was mud, chaos, or broken ground, the Jeep returned, still doing what it did best. It didn't matter that peace had replaced war. The mission was the same: keep moving forward. For many soldiers, seeing their war companion become a civilian workhorse was deeply emotional. "It's like watching a soldier become a farmer," one veteran said. The Jeep had no flag, but it carried the memory of every campaign. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of France, it had been there through every hardship. When General Eisenhower listed the machines that had won the war, he placed the Jeep alongside the C-47 transport plane and the landing craft. "Without the Jeep," he said, "we could not have carried the fight to victory." Coming from the man who commanded all Allied forces, that statement wasn't flattery, it was history. The irony was complete. The vehicle that generals once mocked as a toy had reshaped warfare, logistics, and even culture. It taught armies that mobility mattered more than armor, that simplicity could outperform complexity. It was the mechanical embodiment of democracy, plain, adaptable, and unstoppable. Germany's engineers had built machines of perfection. America had built a machine of persistence. And persistence, not perfection, had won the war. Even the Soviets, who had received thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease, admitted admiration. Russian officers called it the American goat, and even after the war, they tried to replicate it in their GAZ series. The British kept their Jeeps in service for decades, painting them in new colors for new colonies and conflicts. The French used them in Indochina. The Israelis drove them in their first war of independence. Wherever freedom or survival demanded ingenuity, the Jeep returned. It didn't retire, it adapted. In America, it became a cultural icon. Families packed up their new civilian Jeeps for camping trips. Photographers snapped pictures of Jeeps crossing rivers or scaling rocky trails. Hollywood loved it too. Films about the war, The Longest Day, Patton, A Bridge Too Far, all featured the Jeep as much as they featured the heroes. It had become shorthand for courage. To generations born after 1945, it represented a time when technology and humanity worked together instead of against each other. The flat grille, the round headlights, the fold-down windshield, every feature told a story of grit and simplicity. The Jeep wasn't designed for beauty, yet it became beautiful because of what it meant. And it wasn't just nostalgia. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Jeep returned to battle. Soldiers climbed back into its seats like reuniting with an old friend. It crossed frozen rivers, hauled supplies through mountain passes, and once again proved that modern warfare still needed an old idea: reliability. In Vietnam, it evolved into new models, sleeker but with the same soul. The Jeep had become timeless, proof that when something is built right, it never goes out of service. But for many of the veterans who first drove it, the memory of those early years never faded. They remembered its smell, a mix of oil, dust, and gasoline. They remembered how its engine would cough once before catching, how it bounced over ruts, how the steering wheel shook under your hands. They remembered riding with the wind in their faces, half terrified, half alive. And they remembered that it had never failed them, even when the world itself seemed to. One veteran from the 3rd Armored Division put it best: "The Jeep didn't have armor, but it had heart. It got us through everything." Today, that same heart still beats. The Jeep brand has become a global phenomenon, but its DNA remains loyal to its origin. Every modern Wrangler, Cherokee, and Rubicon still carries traces of the Willys-MB, the same 7-slot grille, the same call to adventure. It's more than a car. It's a reminder. When you hear its engine start, you're hearing history. You're hearing the sound of Normandy surf, African sand, Italian rain. You're hearing the hum that once meant survival. And yet, behind the celebration lies a quieter moral. The Jeep story isn't just about invention. It's about humility. It teaches that greatness often begins in ridicule, that small ideas, simple, rough, and underestimated, can reshape the world. The men who built it weren't seeking glory. They were solving a problem. The soldiers who drove it weren't chasing fame. They were chasing survival. And somewhere between those two realities, a legend was born. They called it a toy, the veterans would say, smiling at reunions, but that toy won the war. And indeed it did. The Jeep proved that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it hums quietly, steady as courage itself. By the time the last wartime Jeep rolled into a museum or rusted away in a forgotten barn, its spirit had already outlived its steel. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a symbol of endurance, democracy, and the will to move forward no matter the terrain. It did everything. It went everywhere. And it never complained. General George C. Marshall. So when you see a Jeep climbing a rocky trail today, know that you're not just watching a car. You're watching history on wheels, the descendant of a machine that carried men to victory, and then home again. It began as a blueprint sketched in desperation, laughed at by experts, and ended as the machine that conquered continents. It was forged by necessity, tempered by war, and immortalized by freedom. And maybe that's the real lesson, that the greatest tools of history are not the ones born from power, but the ones born from purpose. The Jeep's journey from insult to icon reminds us that courage often rides in humble forms. Which modern machine mocked today will repeat this story tomorrow?